Consuelo Vanderbilt walked down the aisle in tears, about to enter one of the era's most expensive arranged marriages for $10 million. But before we get to the day she cried behind a locked door, understand the marketplace built around her. Social arbiters circulated going rates in society circles. Contemporaries referenced figures like $2 million for a duke, $1 million for an earl, $500,000 for a baron. This was the most industrialized marriage marketplace in modern history, priced. Before we get to the day she cried behind a locked door, understand the marketplace built around her. Social arbiters circulated going rates in society circles. Between 1870 and 1914, over 500 American heiresses married European nobles in transactions worth an estimated $220 million. That's over $7 billion in today's money. And one bride became the market's defining test case. These weren't love stories. They were business deals with contracts more complex than corporate mergers. This is the story of the dollar princesses, the cold business model that turned American heiresses into European nobility's salvation, and how one woman broke the contract that the entire world had signed off on. The system operated with industrial precision. Professional matchmakers maintained detailed catalogs of eligible European bachelors, complete with debt levels, annual expenses, and minimum dowry requirements. American families provided financial statements proving their ability to meet purchase prices. Lawyers on both sides negotiated marriage contracts that could include penalty clauses, inheritance terms, and even restrictions on the bride's movements. On one side, European aristocrats drowning in debt, their ancient estates crumbling, their titles magnificent, but their bank accounts empty. The agricultural depression of the 1870s had eliminated their traditional income streams. Death duties crushed inheritance after inheritance. These dukes and earls owned palaces they couldn't afford to heat, employed servants they couldn't pay, and maintained lifestyles that required constant cash infusions. On the other side, American industrialists drunk on new money, desperate for social respectability, willing to pay anything for a coat of arms. The Vanderbilts, Astors, and Whitneys had fortunes that dwarfed European royalty, but money couldn't buy them acceptance into American high society. Ward McAllister popularized $400, roughly the size of Mrs. Astor's ballroom, a symbolic velvet rope that kept out new money no matter how vast. European titles offered instant legitimacy. A duchess automatically outranked everyone in American society. Social barriers disappeared overnight. Suddenly you weren't just rich, you were noble. And caught in the middle, their daughters, raised as guarantees in a game they never chose to play, systematically manufactured for export from childhood. Consuelo Vanderbilt was the crown jewel of this marketplace. Her story reveals exactly how this machine operated, and ultimately how it destroyed itself. In 60 seconds, you'll see why Blenheim's creditors forced the clock on Consuelo's wedding. To understand what happened to Consuelo, you need to understand the economics. This wasn't random matchmaking. This was industrial-scale social engineering. By the 1880s, the British aristocracy was hemorrhaging money. Ancient estates required massive upkeep. Death duties and taxes were crushing. The agricultural depression meant their traditional income had evaporated. Dukes who owned castles couldn't afford to heat them. Take the Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo's future husband. Massive upkeep. Death duties and taxes were crushing. The agricultural depression meant their traditional income had evaporated. Dukes who owned castles couldn't afford to heat them. Take the Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo's future husband. Blenheim Palace, a gift from Queen, and was literally falling apart. The roof leaked. The staff went unpaid. The family owed creditors thousands of pounds. Reports suggest Blenheim's creditors had set deadlines. Without immediate cash infusion, wings of the palace would close. The crisis wasn't limited to physical maintenance. These aristocrats were trapped by legal restrictions that prevented them from adapting to economic reality. Most estates were entailed, meaning they had to pass intact to the next generation. Properties couldn't be sold, subdivided, or developed. The aristocrats were asset-rich but cash-poor, sitting on vast wealth they couldn't access. The Duke couldn't simply sell Blenheim and downsize. He couldn't mortgage portions of the estate for ready cash. He couldn't even dismiss staff without violating centuries of tradition and social obligation. Every solution that might work for a normal business was legally or socially forbidden. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America's Industrial Revolution had created unprecedented wealth. The Vanderbilts, Astors, and Whitneys had fortunes that dwarfed European royalty. But money couldn't buy them one thing they desperately wanted: social acceptance. American high society was brutal. Old families loan on new money. The press mocked them as vulgar nouveau riche. They could build the biggest mansions, throw the most expensive parties, but they couldn't escape the sneers. Mrs. Caroline, Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, maintained a list of exactly 400 people deemed worthy of recognition. Her ballroom accommodated precisely that number, and if you weren't on the list, you simply didn't exist in fashionable society. Money meant nothing if Caroline Astor wouldn't receive you. This social exclusion had real economic consequences. Business partnerships often formed in drawing rooms these families couldn't enter. Political influence required social connections they couldn't purchase. Cultural institutions like museums and opera companies were controlled by established families who could block participation by social outsiders. European titles offered instant legitimacy. A duchess outranked everyone. Social barriers disappeared. Suddenly you weren't just rich, you were noble. This created a perfect market opportunity. Professional matchmakers emerged, society women who specialized in transatlantic introductions. They maintained lists of eligible European bachelors complete with debt levels and dowry requirements. They scouted American heiresses, cataloging their fortunes and marriage prospects. Reports suggest matchmakers like Mrs. Perron Stevens circulated specific going rates in society circles. A duke required at least $2 million. An earl could be had for $1 million. Barons were bargain basement at $500,000. These weren't informal introductions. These were business negotiations. Lawyers drew up marriage contracts specifying exact dowry amounts, annual allowances, and inheritance terms. The cash payment, the trust fund, the annual income, even the bride's personal allowance. Marriage contracts could include clauses that would shock modern readers. Some specified penalty payments if the marriage failed to produce an heir within a certain time frame. Others required the bride's family to maintain annual allowances for decades. Many included provisions restricting the wife's movement, social activities, and even correspondence. We'll meet one of those clauses later when an heir becomes leverage. These weren't romantic documents. They were business agreements that treated marriage as a real estate transaction. The bride's happiness, compatibility, or personal preferences were to the negotiated terms. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. American families didn't just pay for titles. They manufactured the perfect brides. Girls like Consuelo were literally shaped for export. From childhood, they were trained in European etiquette, languages, and customs. They learned to curtsy, properly speak French fluently, and navigate complex aristocratic protocols. Consuelo's mother, Alva, went further. She strapped her 10-year-old daughter into steel braces, one rod down her spine, another across her forehead, to ensure perfect posture. The child's legs twitched with pain at night. Every aspect of their development was calculated for the European market. Their education, their appearance, their personality, everything was designed to appeal to aristocratic buyers. They were taught to suppress curiosity, defer to male authority, and never express personal preferences. Their natural American directness was systematically trained out of them. The psychological conditioning was perhaps the cruelest aspect. These girls were taught that their highest purpose was to marry well, that their personal desires were selfish and inappropriate, and that their family's social advancement depended entirely on their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2nd, 1877, into wealth beyond measure. But nobody celebrated. There was no birth certificate, no keepsake book, no recorded words of joy. She wasn't a child, she was a project. Her mother, Alva, was a southern hurricane wrapped in velvet and ambition. Brilliant, unyielding, and precise, she had a plan from day one. Her daughter would marry a duke. Not might marry, would marry. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was Consuelo's first stage. Designed like a French chateau, it was a deliberate statement. We belong in European high society. Every room was a classroom where Consuelo learned to perform nobility. From her earliest days, she was corrected, shaped, refined. Her nose was too pert, her posture too loose, her voice too curious. When she asked questions, she was silenced. When she hesitated, she was told to try again gracefully. Alva made her philosophy clear. Thinking was the mother's responsibility, obedience was the daughter's duty. The steel braces were just the beginning. She later wrote of routine punishments so harsh she described them as daily beatings. Sometimes for poor posture, sometimes for defiance, sometimes for nothing at all. She was ridiculed at dinner parties, her appearance criticized in front of guests. When she voiced an opinion, she was told she lacked taste and had no right to one. The psychological conditioning was systematic and brutal. Consuelo's every movement was monitored and corrected. Her meals were regulated to maintain her figure. Her reading material was censored to prevent inappropriate ideas. Even her friendships were carefully curated. She could only associate with girls from families that might prove useful in the European marriage market. But Consuelo had a secret world. Books. While her body was being shaped into something ornamental, her mind moved at speed. She devoured history and legend in French, German, and English. She dreamed not of gowns or invitations, but of Joan of Arc, of women who resisted, women who led. At night, alone in her vast bedroom overlooking Central Park, Consuelo would whisper her own rebellion into the darkness. She dreamed of female warriors, of women who controlled their own destinies. But these fantasies remained strictly private. Any hint of independence was swiftly crushed. At 17, during a family tour of Europe, something unexpected happened. Consuelo fell in love. Winthrop Rutherford was handsome, discreet American, the sort of gentleman who didn't need to prove anything because he didn't need to take anything. He was no fortune hunter, no title seeker. He was simply kind. They met without guard, spoke without calculation. He didn't speak to her governess, he spoke to her. They exchanged books, walked in gardens, spoke in corners. When he asked quietly, nervously, sincerely if she would marry him, she said yes. For the first time in her life, she had chosen something. But Alva already knew. Letters stopped arriving. Friends stopped calling. Doors closed in synchronized succession. Her governess refused to speak of him. Her social calendar was revised. Then came the emotional manipulation that would make a modern therapist weep. Alva collapsed, claimed heart palpitations. A doctor was called. She lay in bed for days, eyes shut, refusing food, her voice growing thin and tragic. She whispered about being killed, by her daughter's betrayal, about family shame, about everything she had sacrificed. The manipulation was calculated and relentless. Alva had servants report that she was fading away from grief, claiming Consuelo's betrayal had destroyed her appetite. She spoke of the family's ruined reputation, of social exile, of financial disaster. Every guilt technique was deployed to break her daughter's will. Consuelo, terrified, believed it. Winthrop Rutherford couldn't enter her house. His letters were intercepted. His name was blackened in society. And finally, exhausted by her mother's theatrics, Consuelo surrendered. She told her mother to inform him she couldn't marry him. She never saw him again. Enter Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. His nickname was Sonny, though he was neither warm nor bright. 6 years older than Consuelo, pale, thin-lipped, with fine hands and a fine opinion of them. The Duke carried the bearing of 10 generations of English blood and several centuries of unpaid debt. Blenheim Palace was crumbling. The roof leaked. The staff was unpaid. But the name still glittered in Alva's mind like a crown. The match was perfect business. What Consuelo needed no longer mattered. $10 million. In exchange, Alva got what she'd always wanted, Duchess for a daughter. Press called it one of the matches of the century. They cataloged Consuelo like livestock, age 18 years, chin pointed indicating vivacity, nose slightly retroussé, waist 20 inches. Marriage settlement $10 million. On November 6, 1895, New York City erupted in opera glasses and crowds. Thousands gathered outside. Police roped off blocks. Inside St. Thomas Church, an orchestra played Wagner. But upstairs, behind a locked door, Consuelo sat alone in her wedding gown, her face swollen from crying. She had considered running that morning, walking into the crowd, catching a train, disappearing. But where would she go? 20 minutes passed. Below, the Duke shifted.
Blenheim Palace was
was crumbling. The roof leaked. The staff was unpaid. The name still glittered in Alva's mind like a crown. The match was perfect business. He needed money. Alva needed a title. What Consuelo needed no longer mattered. The Duke carried the bearing of 10 generations of English blood and several centuries of unpaid debt. The palace was crumbling. The roof leaked. The staff was unpaid. But the name still glittered in Alva's mind like a crown. The match was perfect business. He needed money. Alva needed a title. What Consuelo needed no longer mattered. The marriage settlement was unprecedented. $10 million, roughly $340 million today. Not a loan, not an investment, a purchase price. The Duke's debts would be paid, Blenheim restored, and the Spencer-Churchill line secured. In exchange, Alva got what she'd always wanted, a duchess for a daughter. The press called it one of the matches of the century. They catalogued Consuelo like livestock, age 18 years, chin pointed indicating vivacity, nose slightly retroussé, waist 20 inches, marriage settlement $10 million. On November 6, 1895, New York City erupted in opera glasses and crowd. Thousands gathered outside. Police roped off blocks. Inside St. Thomas Church, an orchestra played Wagner. But upstairs, behind a locked door, Consuelo sat alone in her wedding gown, her face swollen from crying. She had considered running that morning, walking into the crowd, catching a train, disappearing. But where would she go? 20 minutes passed. Below, the Duke shifted at the altar. Guests murmured. The orchestra kept playing. Years later, Alva would become a crusader for women's suffrage, speaking of liberty and rights. But the first vote her daughter ever cast was this: to betray her own heart. So she stood. The door opened. The veil was lowered over her tear-stained face. She walked down the aisle to 1,400 guests, 60 musicians, and not a single escape route. She had not run. That was all the world needed to know. The price had been paid. Consuelo wasn't alone. The dollar princess phenomenon swept through American high society like a fever. 3 cases reveal the system's core mechanics. Jenny Jerome, Winston Churchill's mother, had been one of the first marrying Lord Randolph Churchill in 1874. She later admitted the marriage was a business arrangement that worked out badly for both parties. Her wedding served as proof of concept. American money could buy British titles, and the social elevation was worth any personal cost. But the marriage revealed the inherent flaws in the system. Lord Randolph was charming in public and indifferent in private. He pursued political ambitions with American money while maintaining affairs with British discretion. When he died young, Jenny found herself back on the marriage market at 41, seeking another title-bearing husband to maintain her social position. Anna Gould married Count Boney de Castellane, who immediately began spending her $15 million inheritance on parties and palaces. When she tried to control the purse strings, he threatened divorce, social suicide for a woman in 1900. The Count immediately began construction on a pink marble palace in Paris, hired an army of servants, and through legendary entertainments that attracted European royalty and American tourists in equal measure. He bought racehorses, art collections, and jewelry with no regard for budgets or consequences. The marriage became a public spectacle of financial abuse. European society gossips enjoyed watching an American heiress being systematically plundered by a charming aristocrat. Anna was trapped between her husband's spending and her family's expectations. Divorce would mean admitting the entire investment had been a catastrophic failure. May Golit became the Duchess of Roxbigny for $2 million. The press called her the $40 million heiress, and she spent her final years alone in a London mansion forgotten by the society that had once celebrated her purchase price. May's story revealed the isolation outcome that awaited many dollar princesses. She achieved the social elevation her family craved. Her duchess title outranked everyone in American society, but found herself permanently estranged from both her American origins and her British aristocratic peers. The pattern was always the same: massive dowries, miserable marriages, and women trapped by the very titles they'd been bought to obtain. Seen together, the pattern explains why Consuelo's exit was rare and costly. For Consuelo, the real horror began after the wedding. Blenheim Palace rose from the Oxfordshire countryside like a fortress carved from golden stone. It had been built as a reward for war, not a home for love. The rooms were vast, the staircases endless. Portraits of dead dukes lined the halls like reminders of duty. There were salons for hundreds but no warmth for two. Her husband kept to himself. He was polite, measured, reserved, and completely indifferent. He complimented her posture once at breakfast. He mentioned the weather. He praised the staff. But he never touched her, not in affection, not in intimacy. They shared dinners, appearances, obligations, not life. No shared stories, no private jokes, no warmth. She had exchanged one form of silence for another. Consuelo later wrote that she became the ornament to a house built for someone else's triumph. When her first child came, a son and heir, the house erupted in celebration. Not for the mother but for the future Duke of Marlborough. Bells rang in the village. Telegrams flew to London. The staff drank champagne. But Consuelo lay in a darkened room while the world celebrated around her. She later wrote that she had fulfilled her purpose and given them what they wanted. Even her children weren't truly hers. A nanny was installed immediately. Traditions were cited. A mother must not spoil an heir with too much affection. She was summoned at set hours for supervised visits, always in the presence of staff members who monitored every interaction. She watched her son grow through doorways and formal photographs, receiving updates like a guest of honor, not a mother. When her second son Ivor was born 2 years later, there was no celebration at all. The dynasty already had its heir. This child was merely insurance. But perversely, this meant Consuelo was allowed slightly more contact with him. Since Ivor's future was less critical to the family's survival, her maternal instincts were considered less threatening. As the novelty of having an American duchess wore off, Consuelo found herself increasingly isolated within British aristocratic society. She was too American to be fully accepted by the British nobility, but too identified with European aristocracy to maintain connections with her American contemporary. British society had initially been curious about the Vanderbilt heiress, but they quickly lost interest once the social season moved on to newer attractions. She was invited to events as a matter of protocol, but rarely included in the informal gatherings where real relationships were formed. Her American friends gradually drifted away as well. When she visited New York, they treated her with the deference due to a duchess rather than the warmth owed to an old friend. The title that was supposed to elevate her had actually isolated her from every meaningful human connection. The marriage lasted 11 years on paper, but it died much sooner. When the Duke began spending more time in London ostensibly for Parliament, Consuelo made no inquiry. When he returned less frequently, she made no protest. There were whispers of his affairs, but the whispers weren't about her heartbreak. They were about her composure. She didn't confront him. She knew her place. In 1906, they separated. Not with drama or scandal, just a letter left on her writing desk expressing that he believed it was time they considered a formal arrangement. There was no cruelty in it, no insult, just the familiar hand of the Duke, measured, precise, and impersonal. The formal end to a marriage that had long since dissolved. But separation brought its own problem. Separated women were barred from court presentations and many social events. She was caught between two worlds, too American for British aristocracy, too titled for American democracy. But here's where Consuelo's story becomes different from the other dollar princesses. Instead of accepting her fate, she began to rewrite it. She threw herself into social work, not the decorative charity expected of duchesses, but real hands-on labor. She opened homes for the wives of prisoners, women whose husbands had been sent to jail, leaving them with children and shame. Instead of traditional aristocratic charity visits, bringing flowers and condescension in equal measure, she leased 2 additional houses, created sewing rooms where women could earn independent income, established nurseries for their children, and spent evenings reading to women who had never been treated as worthy of intellectual engagement. She joined the National Commission on the Declining Birth Rate, the only laywoman among doctors, priests, and economists. When clergy scoffed at her participation, Dr. Marie Stopes stood up. The Duchess of Marlborough was the only person there speaking from lived truth rather than abstract morality. During World War I, she transformed Sunderland House into a coordination center for physicians and organizers coordinating maternity and hospital relief. Her home for prisoners' wives became a maternity annex. She organized hospitals, raised funds, and spoke publicly about infant mortality and maternal health. The press gave her a new name,
The working duchess. At first it felt pointed, almost mocking, but over time it became accurate. She was working not for applause or approval but for change. In 1921, officially divorced from the Duke, Consuelo did something revolutionary. She married for love. Jacques Balsan was a French aviator, kind, clever, brave. Children loved him, so did generals, gardeners, and grand dames. He was not a man who needed to impress, but one who knew how to care. They met during the war when she was still a newlywed duchess, and he was a dashing guest at Blenheim. He had once sent her a postcard before a bombing run expressing that he did not expect to return. Now he had returned, and so had she to herself. Their marriage wasn't recognized by the Catholic Church initially. In France, where Catholicism ruled society, divorce was rare and remarriage without annulment forbidden. His family couldn't receive her, but in 1926, when Marlborough sought his own annulment, her lawyer warned that only proof of coercion would suffice. Alva, in a stunning act of redemption, testified that she had forced her daughter unwillingly to marry. Rome granted the annulment after testimony of coercion, including Alva's sworn admission that she had systematically destroyed her daughter's ability to make free choices about marriage. Consuelo and Jacques made their home in Paris near the green lawns of the Champs de Mars.